we're painting a very exciting and interesting picture of the world and everything. Do we have a sense of more of the jobs and roles of individual people in this world? Like, what are if it, and if we have any of that information, because I know oftentimes it's just not in the record, but I'm always curious about, what are the roles of women or children, men, slavery, what's the everyday person in this world? What's their life like?
Absolutely. As you probably know, I mean, it's very difficult to get into the history of everyday life because everything we have is ultimately an elite story, right?
Yeah.
And so we can extrapolate from that. In Egypt, where the climatic conditions of the desert have allowed us to have papyri surviving, you get more of even there, it's not really everyday story because the poorest still don't even have the resources to write on papyri or on potsherds or something like
Yeah.
that. Again, in I don't want to distract us, but again in Maresha and Idumea, we have a lot of potsherd evidence that tells us about contracts of sales of donkeys and that sort of thing. In Jerusalem themselves, one of our best pieces of evidence is funerary evidence, and these are the
Hmm.
ossuaries where bones of people are placed in, and it paints us a picture of in funerary architect, a funerary in the language of funerary display of relatively traditional Near Eastern family values, a male-dominated society where women are part of male households, and presumably the lower the economic spectrum, work is being performed on both sides, but where really the economic undertakings are done on the male side, unless we're talking about the poorest of the poor, where both sides need to work.
Yeah.
Um, we also know that on a cultic level that women were only allowed at certain parts of the Jewish temple. Also, only Jewish purity laws, which are unclear for us at this time period, ban women, especially during menstruation, from certain parts of religious services. So it is a very male dominated society. It is also a society in which women, like in all other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean world at this time period, where female agency is very limited,
Hmm.
um, where also once young women or even girls get married into other families, they become part of this other household. In funerary culture, which often is a bit more conservative than maybe the environment was, praises for women are that of she was a wonderful mother, she is the mother of that. Is this also how you identify individuals? You don't identify them by themselves, you identify them through their family. That is for both for men and for women. But so the family is an important social hub, but it is an entirely male dominated environment.
Okay. It's still very fascinating. You mentioned, the lack of material evidence, and you talked about how, the desert conditions in Egypt are great for preserving certain things, and it just reminded me, I'd done a previous podcast series on Mesopotamia, and I had found a paper somebody had written where they had just had dozens of translations of tablets that had survived the burning because it was all clay tablets, and so they'd hardened, but it was pages and pages of everyday, people talking about trading or not having good clothes at school and things like that, and it just kind of popped back in my head about how oftentimes our own life kind of the problems we have today translate back to then as well. I was just kind of curious if anything like that had popped up in any of your research you had ever done.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so for example, when we think about Judea and the region, there is, of course, the community at Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, right? And that is probably a community that is not representative for the majority of Judeans at the time. It's a specific, presumably religious group that puts itself into very specific positions at this place, but we have written scrolls and scrolls. It's a specific branch of scholarship that they would have discovered since the 40s and have been published ever since, of telling us about this community, about their rules, about their life in the desert, and what's good, what's bad. they speak of, and this is one of the most interesting things for me, even though it's not the most interesting thing at the site, is they speak of the teacher of righteousness who had led them there. So they're clearly a Judean splinter group that at some point decided that no, what they're doing in Jerusalem is not for us. And so we're going to live here instead. And we're going to be our own community. And so that is one fascinating example. Scholarship has long tried to identify, one of the Maccabean leaders with these. Who is this? With this, that was the reason why this teacher of righteousness and his group went away. They speak of a wicked high priest in Jerusalem, but ultimately we just can't tell. But we can tell that there's a group that felt that their way of life is not going to continue in the best way possible in Jerusalem, so they decided to move towards the Dead Sea and found a new community there. Similarly, in a much earlier period, we have these fascinating documents when, in the context of Alexander's conquest of the Levantine coast, some probably wealthy Sumerian families fled with their most dearest possessions and hid in a cave between Samaria and Jerusalem, and possibly because of carbon monoxide poisoning, died in that cave. And their possessions, their precious documents, landholding deeds, letters, survived, and you can still read them today. They were published in 1997 in the Wadi Dalieh. And it gives you a glimpse of an elite family.
Yeah.
That clearly the changing world that was coming was not for them, so they left. And they met unfortunate circumstances, and therefore their personal documents survived in that cave.
Wow.
So yeah.
So for like carbon monoxide, so they presumably they started a fire in the cave to keep warm or something, and there just wasn't any ventilation, and presumably that something like that.
Presumably, I don't
Yeah.
think we can fully assess how it worked, right?
Yeah.
And if we can, I actually have to admit I don't fully remember how this was determined. But yeah, the idea was that this was meant to be a temporary shelter.
Yeah.
And for one reason or another, it ended up being the last refuge for these people.